So this conversation we titled "The Age of Data" for a couple of reasons. Some of which you have referred to in your Q&A with our previous speakers, but now I think we're going to dive deeper into that subject. In business and journalism, data has long been narrowly viewed as a tool simply to inform business's bottom line or as evidence to support your own reporting. It still is that, but it's much, much more. It is now a treasured commodity that is amassed, analyzed, traded, and it's also become an international measure of political power. While preparing for this session, I was actually on a phone call with Chuin Wei, describing how I was struck by the recent report, I think it was in March, an infographic that they published with the Visual Capitalists, the Hinrich Foundation and the Visual Capitalists, which concluded that more data will be generated in the next 3 years than in all of human history. You know, try to get your head around that, and largely driven by AI's insatiable appetite for information. So we've talked a little bit about AI and the risks associated with that, but I think Chuin Wei and Gareth Tan will take us along a deeper path to examine this age of data. Chuin Wei is back with us, and we talked about how he has been directing the Hinrich Foundation's research on trade. Along with Chuin Wei is Gareth Tan, who is a Senior Associate Director at APCO's Singapore office and leads its technology practice while also playing a coordinating role on several regional technology accounts. Gareth brings nearly a decade of experience with topics such as data governance, digital trade, and emergent technology to advise clients and plan campaigns. Gareth is regional lead for the Digital Prosperity for Asia Coalition, an alliance of digital small businesses seeking ways to navigate the Asia Pacific region's changing policy landscape. That's a mouthful, so he gets to start. And we'll go probably 15 minutes aside, and then we'll open for questions after that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gareth Tan. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Yeah, this is working, right? Great. Thank you guys so much for being here. Really appreciate it. I know that it's the end of a long, long day for you guys, and I'm standing between Chuin Wei and I are standing between you and dinner, so we'll try and keep it as brisk as possible. As Kevin's mentioned, I represent APCO Worldwide, which is a global affairs and public policy consultancy, but I'm also representing the Digital Prosperity for Asia Coalition as its regional lead for the Asia Pacific. And the Digital Prosperity for Asia Coalition is actually a coalition of small businesses from across the region, which aims to, and the coalition aims to basically support the needs of a lot of these businesses with regards to digital regulation. The idea is that digital regulation has become more complex in the region over the past decade in particular, and a lot of them are struggling a lot more, especially small companies. So we aim to provide basically kind of like a stopgap solution for them until they achieve a scale large enough that they can afford their own government affairs departments, basically. So we're kind of a government affairs department for free. So we have about more than 120 members from across 10 countries, and we've engaged with quite a lot of activities with a number of multilateral organizations, including APEC, the World Trade Organization, ADB, and things like that. So we aim to basically connect small businesses with policymakers and vice versa so that they have a bit of a competitive edge in engaging with digital regulation. So moving on to the topic at hand, today I'm here to talk to you a bit about some of the trends on digital trade. There are 3 topics I'm going to be talking through today. First of all, the World Trade Organization and the e-commerce moratorium, which is due to expire this coming year. Next, ASEAN and the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, and then other trends. So moving on very quickly to our first topic, the World Trade Organization, the e-commerce moratorium. And I apologize if I go very, very fast. Please feel free to take pictures of the slides, and if any of you need the slides, eventually they will come. This is going to end up being a lot of text. So how I configured it is that it's going to start, each slide is going to start out with less text and start having more text so that people don't get too confused. First of all, I assume that everybody kind of like knows a fair bit about what the WTO is. So WTO was created in 1994. And importantly, it actually was created in a period that preceded the explosive growth of the internet. So the WTO was created without knowledge, without strong knowledge of what the internet was going to become, how key it was going to be to the digital economies of both developed and developing countries, right? Rules, therefore, at the WTO, like the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, do touch on data, but it's unclear sometimes as to how they apply to new technologies like cloud, right? The World Trade Organization has nevertheless played a very key role in enabling the growth of the tech industry globally, and it has encouraged the adoption of technology, but mainly by reducing tariffs in IT products that form the kind of like hardware layer underlying the digital economy as it exists today. So things like the Information Technology Agreement, which is a plurilateral agreement, and just to take a step back, terminology-wise, bilateral is between two countries, multilateral is within every country that is in a particular grouping. So multilateral within WTO will be all WTO members. Plurilateral is some WTO members. So not every WTO member signs on to the Information Technology Agreement. But the point is that it has includes quite a number of WTO members and has reduced import prices of electronic goods between them that have been necessary for things like the data center industry, for example, by up to 66% between 1996 and 2016. The ITA also facilitated the ITA facilitated the growth of the digital economy, but again, there's nothing, there's very few things in the WTO at a multilateral level, that is to say, affecting all WTO members, that directly addresses the digital directly addresses digital trade, and that is why the e-commerce moratorium is important, because it is functionally the only piece of the WTO that affects all components of digital trade. The e-commerce moratorium, which is more in long form referred to as the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, was introduced in 1998, and it stops WTO members from imposing customs duties or tariffs on electronic transmissions. So the moratorium is not a permanent agreement. It has to be renewed at every single ministerial conference of the WTO, and it has been since 1998, and it was most recently renewed a year ago in 2024, and it's up for renewal again in 2026 next year. Now, taking a step back, you've seen the name of the moratorium. It's a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. So what is an electronic transmission? And that is really the question that is at the core of the moratorium. Because if anybody has covered trade particularly extensively, you know that trade is basically the exercise of like 100 different lawyers kind of arguing each other down until they kind of like agree on consensus on one particular set of language, right? So if a particular piece of language is agreed upon, it is because 100 different lawyers have more or less agreed upon it. So the vagueness of the term electronic transmission is intentional. It is imprecise because it kind of like I said, it was created in an era before people knew what the digital economy was going to be. And therefore, they just kind of like said, yeah, whatever happens, this is going to cover it, basically, right? And because of that, it covers everything. It covers data. It covers digitally transmitted goods and services. It covers everything from movies streamed online to video games that exist entirely in digital form, or data moving from a data center or something like that. That is all covered by the moratorium. Now, for example, if it's a video game and it's in a cartridge or something like that and it has to go across borders, then it gets taxed, right? It gets tariffed. But in this particular way, it's a slightly different configuration, right? So why the fuss this year, right? As the digital economy has grown, as part of the approximate GDP of every single country, developing countries in particular have become quite territorial about data, which they view as a key strategic resource. And, with good reason to a certain extent, right? The idea is that, I'm sure many of you have heard this formulation, data is oil, right, basically. So many developing countries, well, some developing countries, including India, Indonesia, and South Africa, have called for the moratorium to expire because they feel that it would allow them to more directly access the economic value of the data that their countries are producing. The challenge here is, I would say, that like I said, there's some degree of truth to that, but it is a limited degree of truth because data is only valuable if you can use it. If you have data on its own, it's actually a diminishing resource because, especially with AI is demonstrating very clearly, and I'm happy to answer any questions about AI after this as well, by the way. But AI is demonstrating that if you have data that was produced today, very useful. If you have data that was produced a month ago, still useful, not that useful. A year ago, significantly less useful. 2 years ago, not useful, right? Because it doesn't lead to a model, let's say, that is producing up-to-date kind of observations and everything like that. The pattern recognition is not the correct kind of pattern recognition that you are aiming for. So to maybe illustrate the trajectory of the conversation on the moratorium, I want to kind of like look at a bit of language, and this is going to seem really, really kind of like granular, but going back to the point of the 100 different lawyers arguing against each other. In 2019, when this was renewed, the language was basically that members agreed to maintain the current practice of not imposing customs duties, and that's very neutral language. Next, in 2022, it became the moratorium will expire on that date unless ministers of the General Council take the decision to extend. And the most recent renewal basically just says it will expire. So more and more over the past 5+ years, it has come to a point where we're relatively sure that there's more momentum towards allowing the moratorium to expire. And that is a problem because, like I mentioned just now, as I'll mention later on, the moratorium is the core of the digital economy, of the modern digital economy as it exists today globally. And the challenge here also is that because the WTO operates on a consensus basis for multilateral decisions like this one, one member can technically just refuse to have it renewed, and then the entire thing collapses, basically. So that is the danger that we're facing. So why is the moratorium important? Like I said, the moratorium is the only multilateral agreement directly addressing digital trade at the WTO. It forms the basis of modern digital trade and electronic commerce and provides certainty to businesses, both large and small, that digital services can be provided or accessed absent of additional costs or administrative burdens. So maybe a question that some of you might ask is, why not put a tariff on digital services, right? Why can't we put a tariff on digital services? The basic principle of it is that goods, if I have a solid piece of something and I export it, it's very easily traceable because you can't it can't disappear into the aether or something like that, right? I mean, it's relatively easily traceable. I'm not going to say that goods are cannot not be traced or something. But all digital goods are services because there is nothing solid to tag it to. It's data, right? So how do you track data? If you want to track a bit of data, you have to have another bit of data to track it to things. Then you're basically doubling the amount of data that you're creating in order to kind of allow electronic commerce to even exist. So because all digital goods are services and services are infamously difficult to track, by implementing some kind of tariff on services, you're creating enormous due diligence for small businesses in particular. Maybe large businesses will have the ability to overcome this because they have the resources, right? They have an army of lawyers, they have an army of due diligence people, but small businesses in particular have a real challenge kind of with this. And so the e-commerce moratorium has stopped all of these tariffs from being implemented. It has stopped countries from even thinking about implementing tariffs because it's just kind of WTO says it cannot, so it cannot, you know what I mean? So we are in the wake of the past few years, we are already seeing slightly worrying signs. In Indonesia, for example, the Ministry of Finance has implemented a regulation, PMK 190, which establishes procedural rules for import declarations on intangible goods. And again, with any regulation, the words are very, very important. Intangible goods basically means everything that is not a physical good, right? In the US, for example, most recently, the president in response to show business not doing so well in California or something like that, has threatened to impose 100% tariff on movies. And since movies are primarily consumed nowadays in digital form, that would require a kind of tariff on services, right? So we're already seeing worrying signs all over the world. Additionally, customs duties, and like I said just now, customs duties on digital trade would add a lot of duplicative kind of regulations, as well as significant administrative burdens, again, especially for small businesses. And really, I mean, that just a short aside, this is why the DPA is particularly kind of like paying attention to the e-commerce moratorium, because we view it as something that small businesses know very little about, but which affects them very significantly, and which a lot of people outside of the trade space think is just, yeah, it's a fixture, it's not going to go away, but one day it will go away, potentially, and then what's going to happen after that, basically. So what are countries in this region doing about it? Countries like Singapore, Japan, and Australia are actually playing a very significant role in advancing discussions on digital trade, especially regarding the moratorium. A key component of this work is the joint statement initiative on e-commerce at the World Trade Organization. And a joint statement initiative is basically like a working group of interested countries at the World Trade Organization that come together to talk about a particular topic. It could be MSMEs, it could be agriculture. In this situation, it's e-commerce, right? So the joint statement initiative on e-commerce involves 91 WTO members, accounting for 90% of global trade, conducting discussions about this topic. In last year, in July, the JSI concluded negotiations on an agreement on e-commerce, or potentially an agreement on e-commerce, that was agreed upon by the majority of JSI participants. And the stabilized text actually includes an article on customs duties that proposes a permanent moratorium with a 5-year review window, right? So this would basically kind of like remove the anxiety that every 2 years it goes away, right? The JSI co-conveners have since moved on to discussions about implementation and adoption. But I mean, from a lot of the conversations that I've been privy to, again, implementation of this at a multilateral level would require the acquiescence of every WTO member. And there are many WTO members, like I mentioned, India, Indonesia, South Africa, who are quite opposed to the moratorium, right? So that is a challenge that we're facing with the moratorium. Moving on very quickly to ASEAN, ASEAN, as everybody knows, is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It consists of the 10 ASEAN countries, soon to be 11 potentially, and we are potentially on the verge of unlocking some very interesting economic potential here with the potential passage of the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, the DEFA, in ASEAN. And DEFA would be the world's first binding regional digital economy agreement that aims to unlock ASEAN's economic potential by clearing barriers to digital trade. So what is going to be covered by DEFA? Short answer, nobody knows, because the negotiation text has not been made available to many people. But DEFA is currently assumed and has been verified by our internal discussions with some of the Secretariat members as well, to be shaped on some of the chapters that ASEAN member states have already signed on to in other deals. So for example, let's say Singapore or Vietnam are part of have acceded to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, and the RCEP, for example. And so a lot of chapters on e-commerce from those agreements are being used as the basis for what people assume that DEFA is going to cover as well. So expected areas of focus include things like e-invoicing, cross-border data flow, source code, and things like that. But areas of contention, which we've heard that certain ASEAN member states are still pushing back on quite significantly, are non-discriminatory treatment for businesses, which in this trade agreement context would mean that each country is required to treat any incoming country from any business from another ASEAN country as equal to their own. So they're not allowed to discriminate against them, right? Or cross-border data flows, basically not allowing for data residency as a requirement to do business in your country, for example. One slightly controversial element as well is going back to the moratorium. There's a proposal to implement a ASEAN level moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. Again, because there is a consciousness that that the WTO's moratorium may expire, in which case then there may be a need for some degree of regional safeguarding of that capability, basically. And I mean, just an aside here, this speaks, I think, to the potential regulatory fragmentation that we see with the continued evolution of the WTO into its current state, where different regions of the world may come together to kind of like find their own alternatives to some of the mechanisms that they used to be able to depend on the WTO for. And that's something that I think we are watching very closely. So why should you be paying attention to DEFA? DEFA has the potential to strengthen the value proposition of ASEAN as an economic bloc and give it greater leverage in its negotiations with some of its larger trading partners, right? The fact of the matter is that if there's one thing that the Liberation Day tariffs have demonstrated, it is that small countries do need to find some recourse to being pushed around by larger countries. And in that context, DEFA potentially allows ASEAN to start functioning or operating as a more unified digital economy, allows it to have greater heft in negotiating with some of its larger trading partners. Additionally, ASEAN ministers, the ministers of the relevant ministers in charge of this negotiation have publicly declared as well that negotiations will conclude conclusively by 2025, indicating that there's a lot of commitment there, and that's an important factor actually, because there's a lot of pressure on ASEAN to achieve some result, because if a minister says something and in ASEAN as a forum, there is a strong degree of pressure on them to actually follow through on that. Otherwise, the country kind of looks bad, basically. I mean, like, it's a bit of a face thing. And because DEFA would potentially be binding on signatories, ASEAN's consensus-based model would make coming to an agreement on some of the more touchy issues in DEFA a bit more challenging, which could lead to compromises that a lot of observers are concerned could reduce the impact of the final agreement. So what are the most recent developments with DEFA? As of June 2025, DEFA is understood to still not have hit 50% completion, raising concerns that this will be a sprint to the finish line. But there's still very strong commitment, in our conversations with the Secretariat as well as some of the main governments behind it, that they will finish by the end of the year. But recent indications suggest that they are now going to focus on achieving consensus on substantial text. So what substantial text means in this context is basically just they'll put together more or less the big picture of what they want to achieve with DEFA, and then a lot of the implementation and a lot of the details are going to come next year. So currently the chair is Malaysia. They're really trying to push it through as much as possible. And then Philippines, next year's ASEAN chair, will carry on a lot of the more detailed discussions. So there's also discussions about differentiated approaches that ASEAN could take. A phased approach is probably going to be inevitable. A phased approach is one where different countries, which are at different levels of development in ASEAN, may adopt different parts of the agreement at different times, right? Alongside that, there's also the ASEAN minus X approach, which is a less desirable approach where the entire agreement may just become like a plurilateral, where it's accepted by some countries and not other countries. Yeah. So on the last point, and apologies for going over time, we wanted to just talk. I just wanted to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing with regards to some of the digital regulation that has relevance actually to AI regulation. In particular, what is happening with the so-called Brussels effect. Some of you may have heard of this term. Basically, it refers to the EU's ability to rely on its gigantic market, on its very large advanced market, to compel international regulations to align or comply with EU standards. Things like the General Data Protection Regulation that some of you may have heard of, being kind of copy-pasted by a lot of countries and adapted slightly because they want to kind of like achieve some degree of parity with what the EU has to offer. This is something that we have seen to a certain extent with other regulations as well, like most recently the EU AI Act. And that is something that we're seeing in this region too. A few different governments have been looking at the EU AI Act as a model to kind of like create AI regulations based off of. But recent developments in the EU, for example, are calling this into question. For example, there was a publication of a report called the Draghi Report on EU Competitiveness by former Italian Prime Minister and ECB Chair Mario Draghi, that has indicated that even internally there is doubt about whether or not the EU's very robust and very muscular stance on regulation is something that they want to carry forward internally as well. The repercussions on this region are that a lot of different economies in Asia are now considering whether or not EU models are really the best models to base their own regulatory things on. And a lot of the consideration for that is how enforceable EU models are in this region. Many of you who have covered, some Southeast Asian countries may have noticed that while in Thailand, for example, while they implemented personal data protection regulation that was very in line with the EU's GDPR, it took them about 4 years to actually kind of accede to that, and there were 2 subsequent delays of more than a year because many businesses indicated that they were not able to comply with the requirements there. So there's a lot more conversations about this happening. And as a shameless plug for the DPA, we are also working on some reports to indicate, to find out a bit more about the economic implications of importing EU model regulations. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Gareth. Gareth sort of started at a pretty high level, kind of like chapter, 7 of the book. And I guess it's an opportunity now for me to sort of wind it back a little bit and go back to why we are talking about all this. And one of the reasons why, and you've heard this earlier in the earlier sessions, Parag mentioned it, Steve Okun mentioned it, which is all of this is about globalization and the idea that we are on the cusp of globalization falling apart. And both of them sort of, in their own way, sort of question that notion. And it, when it comes to services, when it comes to data, when it comes to e-commerce, when it comes to AI, this is absolutely true. Globalization, the idea of that globalization is dead is a fallacy. And you have to understand this because in some areas that are critical to the global economy, globalization is alive and kicking. And it is particularly so in the case of services. Why is that important? Because services is a much smaller component of global trade right now. Global trade is in merchandise, in goods and stuff. Everybody knows it's close to flatlining, and it's in danger of being politicized to the point where it might go negative. Even at current projections of this scenario, the projections are that services in the trade and services is going to continue to grow, and it is growing at about 3 to 4 times the pace of merchandise. Now that means that in about 5 to 10 years, services as a driver of the global economy is going to be the most critical engine of global growth. So this is why we worry about the impediments that are being put in place of services, which is everything that Gareth had just talked about in terms of e-commerce and what's happening in digital goods, digital services at ASEAN, at the WTO, at various fora. Because the nature of services is extremely difficult, as Gareth said, sometimes to pin down. That notion of calculating what is a service and how much value there is in it has always made it a rather more nebulous subject. I mean, it's really only, as you pointed out, in the last 20 years or so that we got a better idea of what might constitute a service, first of all, and how you might derive value out of it. And this is particularly useful for governments, because when governments think, what do they think about? First and foremost, they think about money, revenue. How am I going to get some money out of this? And in the days when you didn't know what a service really was and at which point you could tariff it, um, it was a subject that you could set aside. Now, what's changed all this is the advent of data. Data has made it possible to compartmentalize services down to the degree where you can capture what they call, what in economic terms you call economy-wide input-output. So you can trace the point at which an input is put into a process and the value of the output. And the amount of data will tell you how much that value is. It helps because it gives you an idea of how you size this thing called value add in economic terms. I mean, what this is all really about when we talk about growth. It's about growth and value add. So data gives you that ability to do those two things, to put numbers, accurate numbers on those two things. And it also has an additional advantage. It helps you, in this day and age, it helps you to identify the origin of the products. The value chains these days, as you all know, is very complex. Goes all over the world, crosses borders many times before a good is made or a service is made. And identifying where this thing comes from becomes increasingly important to governments that care about a world that's being bifurcated. And data helps you do that. Now, if you're going to put revenue barriers, revenue hurdles in the provision of services, well, you could do that. But you have to think about, well, how are you going to do that? Gareth mentioned earlier this threat. I'm going to put 100% tariff on movies. That doesn't seem to have panned out. And one key question, I suppose, it doesn't occur to some people when they make threats like that is, well, at which point in the value chain do you want to tax this thing? Are you taxing box office revenue? Are you taxing syndication? Like, what is it? What is it in that process that you're going to put the tariff on? So if you don't figure out that, and you don't figure out how a service is delivered, it makes the threat, it illustrates the nebulous nature of this product as it is being delivered that you're trying to tariff. However, the growth of this sector is so enormous that governments around the world are now looking at it and thinking, well, there is no way that we can want to give up the sovereign right to be able to get some revenue out of this. It's a golden goose. It's waiting to happen. Next year, a really critical juncture is going to happen. The e-commerce moratorium, which has existed since, as Gareth said, since 1998, is pretty much almost certain to be killed because of the way the WTO is structured. I'm sorry? Well, yes. I mean, this is the most important thing that is going to happen if we let it pass at next year's ministerial conference of trade ministers when they gather in Cameroon for the WTO ministerial. These ministerials happen once in 2 years. Every 2 years, they get a little bit closer to killing the moratorium. Next year, it is almost certain that the moratorium will be ended, giving governments all over the world a free hand to, just as someone proposed 100% tariff on tariffs, to do exactly that, or worse, find other ways to tariff the tax. Now, what does that mean to you? I mean, you are journalists, but you are consumers too, and the people you cover. It means that your music is going to be tariffed. Your movies, which you probably stream, are going to be tariffed. Your software is going to be tariffed. and more importantly, for your economies, wherever you are, a lot of services are SME driven. That means small businesses. A lot of them allow segments of society to come into the economy, people like women, minorities, that they never would have a chance before. Now, that ability to do so is reduced when you make it more expensive. So, when we think about all these issues, it's highly complex and it opens up a lot of different rabbit holes of exploration. I mean, most of you are like daily journalists. I take it. I mean, except for the Wire China. Where's the Wire China? Are you the Wire China? Are you guys very focused on? I mean, do you have beats that drill down to levels of where you're looking at just pure data and just pure? You do. Excellent. And the information, of course. Where's the information? Yeah, right. Information is way ahead of this game, and I guess that the larger Bloomberg would be another place that can afford it. So what we can afford at the Hinrich Foundation is to take a step back and sort of look at the issue as a narrative, as a visual, because sometimes when you tell these stories, they deal with highly complex subject matter, and the best way to come into the story is to come into it visually. Do you have the clicker that I could? So we did this every year. We do a deep dive with our partners in Vancouver called Visual Capitalists, and every year we pick a different subject. The first one we did ever was on carbon. And the second year, I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, let's do one on water. So we did one on carbon, we did one on water, and the third year we were like, well, what are we going to do? I was just scratching my head one day, and I thought, well, what, fire? Like what? It's like because I wanted it to be very elemental. I mean, this is something that we do as part of our sustainable trade index, and I always like it to be about one single simple subject. I was racking my brains, and well, data, because it's the most current thing, and it is the most elemental thing that is going to be a part of our lives. So we do these things as a story. It's a storybook, and so we introduced it slowly, with the idea, as Kevin mentioned earlier, about this enormous growth in data, some of which uh, isn't great. But that's a whole other subject altogether, because so much data is being produced that the LLMs are kind of sometimes cannibalizing themselves. But that's another story. And then we this is essentially a history. So if you have visual units still in your news organizations, good for you, because I know that they are just chopping them out of your news operations, which is the saddest thing to ever happen. So if you ever have the wherewithal to persuade your editors, keep your visual departments. They are essential to your operations. Or if not, find an outsourced partner that can help you do it. So this is a historical timeline that we made of how information has been displayed through the ages. And one thing you'll notice when we did this visual essay is, because the subject is so modern, I specified to visual capitalists that I wanted a look and a feel to this essay that looks old and looks ancient. So we had this look like papyrus, just the ancient paper. And I specified that the font, I wanted it to look a bit like bones, and the overall sort of color of the entire report, I wanted it to look like, because there's a sculpture I really love that is, it's bronze. And if you know bronze, you sort of think about bronze statues as being sort of greenish because of the oxide. But bronze also can appear to look like anything you want, shiny, or in this particular case, the sculpture that I particularly liked was the process is called patination, which is an application of acids to the bronze. And this one in particular made it look like wood. And I really loved that bony color. And I said, I want you to recreate this color. So they made this palette uh, for me, which is great. So one key aspect of presenting the data story is through maps. This is a very effective way of always telling a story that is global. And you have to sort of point out, and later on in this visual essay, it becomes more and more apparent why we do it. This is about AI's, the advent of AI generating more data than ever before. That's a potentially negative thing. In some aspects, the EU AI Act that Gareth refers to is trying to control that. But the side effect of what it does is that it kills the innovation that comes with the golden goose. So we talked about which countries control which data, and we talked about opportunities and challenges. Here we sort of drift into AI because inevitably all this ends with AI. And you see where AI is learning the best here. A lot of it is just playing around with visuals. I'm just going to like flick through all of this, and you'll see that this one in particular is a picture of subsea cables, and you kind of see the world. It's a map, but it's a map of subsea cables, and it tells you in quite to me, is a visually striking way of understanding that data travels through physical conduits. And those physical conduits are subject to geopolitics. And geopolitics right now dominates trade. So now we moved into the war on data. And it tells you the amount of restrictions that you're already beginning to see. I can't see, my eyes are failing me. I see it from there. Eyes failing me, I can't pivot, blah, blah, blah. And you'll see that Europe in particular is green, and it has a medium, and this is the World Bank, if I recall, a medium level of data restrictiveness. And that's more or less right if you sort of view it from, well, what is restrictive? Now, what is restrictive, if you think about it in terms of localization of demands on where companies put their servers and where they locate their data, Asia is a pretty restrictive place. I mean, you can see that. This chart tells you a little bit more. When you look at the number of interventions that they have held, you'll see that suddenly Europe is a much darker shade of green. And that means that they are highly interventionist in a way that perhaps Asia isn't so much. You can see that. So these are ways that you can tell the story without using that much words, because it's quite complex. And this is an important point because it relates back to what Gareth is talking about. What's happening today in Asia is that Asia is on the cusp of deciding what is it going to do. And I can, let me share with you one thing, and it has nothing to do with this graphic. So if you look at the e-commerce deal that is hanging by a thread at the WTO that Gareth was talking about, and Gareth said that it had about 91 countries. I'm sorry, it's slightly inaccurate because it began with 91 countries. So 91 countries 5 years ago came together and said, you know what, we want to have a deal on e-commerce. We want to set the base rule, the sort of basic rules of what is one of the most important industries that we're going to have for the rest of our lives. 5 years later, the e-commerce moratorium was almost killed. Now, a bunch of these countries, instead of going back to Geneva, instead of going back to their home capitals, just bedraggled and disillusioned and just wanting to take a holiday, they got angry. And they said that, this will not stand. This is a line in the sand and we are fighting back. And this includes Singapore, it includes Australia, it includes Japan, and it included about 80-something of those 91 countries. And what happened was that there was a quiet rebellion that was going on in Geneva. And these countries were saying that we are going to have an e-commerce deal, do or die, we are going to do this. And that's where we are. In late April of last year, this group, at the time, 82 countries, signed on to what is called the stabilized text. I apologize for all these very, very tedious terms. It's just that that's how they speak.
It is. It's very sad. Yeah.
Yeah. They came up with this stabilized text, which in effect is an e-commerce deal. 82 countries on board, just about half of the 166 members of the WTO. In it, the preservation of the e-commerce moratorium. And this deal is probably going to get killed along with the e-commerce moratorium because it cannot make it into the WTO's canon of legal agreements. So it can only survive in the shadows or not exist at all. So we have two things, and now the membership of this deal is down to about 70-something members because some have dropped out along the way. The survival of the e-commerce moratorium and the survival of the e-commerce JSI, as they call it, are crucial to the future of services, to the future of data, because the innovation that drives the way data is being created and the value that data has in terms of putting a price on what we pay as services and hopefully bringing down that price and giving us an ability to understand what is it that we are paying for and what portion of it are we willing to give to the government. That is an important piece of what we talk about when we talk about trade. It is an understanding of what relationship do you want to have with your governments and how much control you want them to have over the data that you have, that you own. So we ended it with stay informed, and that's probably where I'll wrap up. I mean, there's a whole other conversation on regulations because Gareth again touches on this. Europe is a great example. You don't want to have a regulation of data and AI to the point where you can influence a country's elections. Clearly, you don't want to have that. But neither do you want to have regulations that will kill the technology companies that are driving the innovation of this one thing that is left in the global economy's key drivers of growth. And I'll tell you something, Asia can't decide. I mean, Gareth is very optimistic about this. I'm rather more, much more cynical than he is, good man.
I'm a younger person. It's fine.
Yeah. When you look at the e-commerce deal that is going to die next year and that we have worked so hard to try to preserve.
Dagger in my heart.
Yeah.
Every time.
And you look at ASEAN. Let's leave out East Timor for now. Let's go with the 10 members of ASEAN. ASEAN, a place that is export-driven, depends heavily on services, more than anything, has SMEs that are using e-commerce as a critical means of lifting their populations out of poverty. And who's in and who's out of the e-commerce deal? Who's in? Singapore, obviously, we're a co-convener. Malaysia, Laos, and Myanmar, probably just sort of like going with the flow. And Brunei, probably just going with Singapore's flow. Who's out? Who's in the out column, not in the deal? Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Cambodia. Who am I missing?
Vietnam.
Vietnam was never in the e-commerce talks to begin with, not even in the 91, when it was first convened 5 years ago. So you can see, even in a region like ASEAN, you have 5 and 5. So whatever you hope at the end of the year, good luck. So
We live in hope.
So that's where I want to leave it. It is a highly contentious issue. If there's anything that you cover out of this at the end of your stints, if pay attention to what's happening on e-commerce next year at the WTO, and whatever you can do to sort of save this moratorium, I think the world will thank you for it. Anyway, question time.
That's a good way to leave it. Good luck.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shreya from Business Standard Newspaper India. So my question is regarding the e-commerce moratorium. So one part is about how we mentioned that US's idea to impose 100% tariff on movies. Isn't it very contradictory to what US's stand is at the WTO? How does that work out? And also, as far as the e-commerce moratorium is concerned, so developing countries are of the view that certain digital players, as time has evolved, they are also making a lot of profits. So this would sort of be a right time to also sort of tax, this space. So what do you have to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, on the point about the United States, I think the United States' stance at WTO has changed very significantly over the past few months, certainly. I mean, you may know that the US is no longer paying its dues to WTO. It actually comprises 11% of the WTO's budget. And so their kind of like retreat from the situation is leaving quite a significant hole in the discussions. I mean, to Chuin Wei's point, one of the countries that has actually pulled out of that deal is the United States. As in, like, the United States is not formally indicated its agreement with the e-commerce deal, and that was actually potentially a significant domino pushing in that direction. But importantly, it's important to look at the fact that the US should not be the singular kind of like bellwether for international trade anymore. International trade, I think, has created positive circumstances for countries all across the world, developing and developed countries, in ASEAN certainly as well. And it is incumbent on small countries as well to also, stand up for trade.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a delicate answer. I mean, the answer has to be delicate. The United States is, if you take certain personalities out of the discussion, conflicted about this. Now, even when he was destroying the dispute settlement system at the WTO, Bob Lighthizer, the former USTR under the first Trump administration, made sure that the US always kept a seat at the e-commerce talks. Always, all the way, and was quite supportive. They dropped out in April last year when the stabilized text came out. And it wasn't because, I mean, based on sources that have disclosed this, because they didn't support it. It was simply because the US couldn't be seen in a WTO deal together with China supporting an aspect of trade in an election year. It's just you will lose. So they said, well, hold on, and they dropped out. There's one significant development. They brought the deal to what they call the General Council of the WTO. The General Council is basically all the ambassadors of the countries, the 166 countries, and they are the deciding body in Geneva of the institution itself. if you want to get anything done, legalized at the WTO, you have to go to the General Council. So they put the WTO deal, the stabilized text, to the General Council in February, fully expecting it to be killed. And it was, by Indonesia, by South Africa, by India, you know, all the usual objectionists. Refuseniks, I think in, you know, the one way of putting it. The United States didn't object, which is to say that the United States was actually willing to let this deal go ahead, even if they're not in it. And I think that if you were to architect a way back for the United States into the rules-based trading order, it is a frail reed to hang on to. But e-commerce is the way to do it. The e-commerce deal at the WTO remains that narrow opening through which you could draw the United States back to the table. Why do I say this? Because the US has a lot to lose here. I mean, the technology companies are some of the most profitable and innovative producers. And a lot of what the EU is doing when it regulates with the Digital Markets Act and with the AI Act is actually trying to control what big tech can do within the EU jurisdiction. That's what it's all about. So, you know, when Trump threatens 100% tariff on movies, you know, it could be, you know, him just sort of like riffing. But if you look at the overall technocratic direction of the US, it does not support a desire to tariff e-commerce or electronic transmissions, if you want to call it that. Now that is a little different from saying taxation. Sorry, I'm just getting a bit nerdy here because the whole idea of the language of what is an e-commerce moratorium, and then a moratorium is on taxation or tariffing. It's actually on tariffing, because if you start talking about taxes, does Singapore tariff e-commerce? The answer you guys would instinctively say is no. But actually it does in a form of GST, general service, you know, the general the goods and services tax. So you actually pay 9%. Now, is that an e-commerce tax? Well, it is. But is it an e-commerce tariff? No, it's not. So the United States is going after things like value-added taxes and GSTs, S and NTB, which is a completely different proposition from going after tariffs on services. So that kind of distinction, you have to really understand, and it's a different kettle of fish what they are trying to do. Is GST and is value-added tax a tariff? Is it a non-tariff measure? I mean, we're on the record, right?
Are we?
I personally don't think so. It is a sovereign country's right to impose a consumption tax on its domestic, you know, within its domestic jurisdiction. So the argument now is that, well, it may not be. It might be a non-tariff measure. Anyway, that's a whole different argument. This is a very long answer, sorry, to your very intelligent questions.
Sorry, to the point about developing countries as well. I mean, I refer to the point I made earlier about the fact that, you know, data, there is a value to data, but it's only a value as long as you can kind of extract it. If you have the resources, the talent, the skills to actually extract the value from the data. And a lot of the time that requires the use of tools or the use of, you know, like facilities that may not be located in your country for whatever reason. A country like a developing country like India, for example, may have access to facilities now, but it wasn't necessarily the case previously. So now actually, in many ways, India actually stands to suffer from the removal of the e-commerce moratorium because it is a net exporter of digital services and digital goods as well, functionally. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks for the presentation. This is Ying from Gulf Insider. I have two questions about DEFA itself because I think I can't help but I'm reminded of the Singapore-Johor or Special Economic Zone,
Yes.
where it's been like down, up, and then I think there's a lot of SMEs that mentioned that because of the change in political leadership and commitment, they're not sure whether they want to invest. They want to go into Johor, Malaysia to invest as well. And so I'm seeing maybe some symptoms with DEFA as well, because you did mention that it's not even 50% there, but you're sort of hopeful that we'll eventually get there when it comes to the whole framework itself. And so my first question is, aside from phase, like every country just committing, ASEAN is quite diverse when it comes to, political leadership change and things, and the commitment might not be there anymore. What are the other factors that you're hopeful in terms of whether it might allow DEFA to come to fruition? This is my first question. And the second part is, if DEFA doesn't go through, are there some low-hanging fruits that ASEAN can work on to accelerate a digital economy?
Sure. I think to the first point, aside from just the phase component, I think there is an increasing awareness of the need to present a stronger value proposition at the ASEAN level. This is not necessarily an immediate cause for optimism. Each individual country in ASEAN will take a long time to kind of like fall in with this idea. But generally speaking, the policymakers that we've spoken to have changed their tune slightly, I think, because it used to be the case that, like everybody would give ASEAN kind of lip service, but everybody would just kind of say, oh, this is a vehicle for X other ASEAN country, basically, and this is not my problem. Now, I think more and more of them are being a bit more invested in the discussions. Again, it's not something that will manifest immediately, but we're hoping that it will be something that kicks up next year when they're talking about the implementation frameworks for DEFA as well. In terms of the completion, like I said, they're only aiming for substantial text at the end of this year, which means that it's not the full completion and implementation of it. So we're hoping that at the very least, the framework that is produced at the end of this year is a relatively robust one. And the second question, pardon me, was about. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, I think if there's anything, again, that the Liberation Day terrorists have demonstrated, it is that global trade, as Chuin Wei has mentioned, is definitely not dead. A lot of different countries are becoming a bit more kind of inclined towards seeking their own engagements in terms of like securing trade agreements and whatnot. Thailand, for example, is working very strongly to kind of engage with the European Union. India has renewed its engagement with a number of different parties, for example. So I think this is something that will definitely continue in the Asia Pacific as a whole, and definitely within ASEAN as well. I mean, I don't anticipate that the situation moving forward will lead to a diminution of ASEAN significance. I think ASEAN significance. I think that it will only lead to eventually countries realizing that they do need to stick together in the absence of the United States as the singular arbiter as it used to be potentially in the past. But again, I'm an optimist, so I have no choice but to be optimistic. There's a long road ahead of us.
No, but, and on this point, I agree with Gareth that there will be very likely a baseline of desire in ASEAN for that kind of achievement. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and they will, in all likelihood, produce that substantive text. It's when you drill down to the issues where you start seeing the differences emerging. But that's natural. I mean, that's ASEAN. That always happens. But the baseline desire is a common one, and it is very different from what you see in other major jurisdictions. So it's headed in the right direction. All the comments that I made earlier about the different ASEAN positions. on the e-commerce JSI and the WTO, well, that's a separate matter because that actually addresses a lot of other key tenets
Yes.
of the World Trade Organization itself and the politics within it that are not quite the same as ASEAN DEFA.
Yeah. ASEAN is a safer space.
So yeah, we are going in that direction. And what was I going to? Yeah, that was. I had thought about something else, but anyway, it sort of slipped my mind. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we have to leave it there, but I think when we were planning this session, I didn't realize I was pairing two rivals here. One optimist, one
We actually
pessimist.
agree on it.
No, not rivals,
but
but
Same coin.
no, but in thought. So
I'm just more pessimistic than Gareth is.
so that's why you should take this show on the road. But thank you. It's a perfect way to cap day 2.
Thank you, Kevin.
And thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, everybody.